right, so joining us via Zoom this morning, Lloyd Distant, Chairman of the Crime Monitoring Oversight Committee, CMOC. I'm hoping he'll tell me if I got that right. He's here to address some pressing challenges facing Jamaica and how we can improve the national consensus on crime. So, Lloyd, good morning. How are you?
Morning, sir. How are you?
Morning, Simone. Morning. Simone, you asked me just to correct. It's actually the Consensus Monitoring and Oversight Committee. So it's a crime consensus, and I know most people refer to it as the Crime Monitoring and Oversight Committee, but we're actually measuring the results of the agreements in the consensus itself.
So that means it's not CM?
But it is CM, but it's consensus.
Consensus monitoring.
Okay, it's consensus monitoring. Okay, all right.
Thank you for that correction, sir. Appreciate. So let's talk a little bit first about high level about your take on crime and what you see happening in our country. Let's start there.
I think like all Jamaicans, we continue to recognize that crime, violence, and corruption is absolutely out of hand. It has continued to be problematic, a challenge. For us as Jamaicans and for the society as a whole, we want to see it reduced and significantly reduced quickly. I hasten to say that notwithstanding all the challenges, there's some progress that is taking place that we all don't, because we are so mired in the numbers that we see every day, on the occasions where we see the huge flare-ups of mass shootings or killings of innocent or youngsters, it certainly flares up. So the issue has continued, but there are things being done to curb it, and I think we certainly need to recognize those things as well.
So CMOC's overall role would be what, Mr. Distant?
Okay. So I'll take it quickly back. In August of 2020, we had a bipartisan agreement. So both the government, opposition, as well as broad civil society, the private sector organizations, Chamber of Jamaica manufacturers, the churches, groups of churches, Confederation of Trade Unions, the Women's Coalition, they all came together, broadest amalgamation of civil society you could imagine, came together along with the government and opposition and signed a consensus on crime. So the consensus was focused on things that we achieve a sustainable reduction. It wasn't to cover every single item that needed to be done to reduce crime, but we recognized that what we needed was a sustainable reduction. And the consensus that was signed had 39 items that were agreed, that we said that's critical thing that we do to eliminate criminal gangs, to reintegrate the community, transform our society, to transform the constabulary report. So speak about seven pillars, and there are 39 items that we identified under those 7 pillars.
Okay.
So the fund. So what CMOC does is just monitor the progress that we make in achieving the items in the country.
All right. I want you to, first of all, to come a little closer to your device because you're speaking, but you're chipping out. And I think perhaps if you project your voice a little more loudly, a little more closely, then we can eliminate that problem a little bit. So thank you. I see you moved already. So 39 is a lot, Sir Distant. So let's look at maybe did you rank them in order of priority? And if so, can we look at maybe your top 3? And can we get like a scorecard as to where we are? Because if you say things are getting out of hand, it would suggest to me that we're trending in the wrong direction.
But I say things have been out of hand. And the fact is that we continue to see flare-ups in crime that none of us are happy to see. We want to see that reduced. There really wasn't an ordering of priority in determining the items. I think fundamentally everyone agreed that sustainable reduction in crime and violence required social, cultural, and community transformation. So there are things that we can do with the criminal justice ecosystem. I would say the justice system, the correctional services, the police force, but sustainable reduction required, and you're talking about the things that we need to do in schools around values and attitudes and discipline and courtesy. We require a cultural transformation. So if nothing else, that is fundamentally the thing that we need to achieve. but it doesn't remove all the other items that are quite important. The modernization of the justice system, the transformation of the constabulary force, enhancing correctional services, focusing as well on accountability and corruption. What's happening from the perspective of the leaders of society, but across the society on a whole, what we've seen is a continued increase in corruption in many instances. And it also focused on looking at those informal communities, we call them squatter communities. The concept also, it was quite comforting. And it was recognized at the time that there's no one or two that's more important than others. All of these things needed to be done.
Yep.
In relation to a scorecard, if you want me to pause there, I can just
go ahead. Sure.
So from a scorecard perspective, of the 39 items in the agreement, as at September of this year, just about 60% of them would have been either achieved or still in progress to be achieved. The other 40% would have either been just not achieved, and we don't have a new deadline date, or they're tracked behind plan or expectations.
Mm-hmm.
The question here, 60%, you don't think that's a failing rate or not good enough? And I'd say 60% was not good enough. We have to recognize that some big things that we've been waiting for decades were achieved within the 3 years.
Right.
A new Public Bodies and Management Accountability Act that we screened for just to improve the accountability in the public sector. The National Commission on Violence Prevention, established by Parliament to focus and identify what are the programs or interventions that will actually give us an improvement in the change in the social fabric. You both may remember that 2 years ago, CAPI came out with a study that indicated it spent $380 billion on youth programs, and they could not evaluate more than 10% to see whether or not they were successful. That's why it was important to have the report from the National Commission on Violence Prevention. That has been done. And several others. The Firearms Act that we were waiting for, some upgrades to the Correctional Services Act, which came through as well, but also the work that has been done in transforming the constabulary force. And there's still a lot to be done, but it's one of those things. If you attended the expo earlier this year, you'd understand why we ought to be proud about the transformation that is taking place. The constabulary force we have now is not the constabulary force that we had 10, 15 years ago, both in terms of personnel and their capabilities, as well as the tools and technology that exists.
Yeah.
I could continue, but I just want to give you a snapshot of some of the good things that we see taking place.
Sure.
Yeah. Mr. Distant, the opposition and some other folks, in recent times, we've heard of zones of special operations in recent times, a couple of years now. And the opposition and other folk have said that they don't think that's the way to go. I'm not certain it's helping because we're still having crime, and actually we're having murders in the areas where we have the zones of special operations. I'm not asking you here whether you agree that they should or shouldn't, but what else can be done? Because I'm repeating myself here, but we're still seeing murders and whole lot of crime going on in those areas. What else can be done to stop it? I keep saying it's only we can stop it. I don't think the commissioner or the police or the prime minister can stop it. I think all of us have to come together and decide, so we've had enough. But what else can be done? How do we stop this, sir?
It's interesting that you say it's a lot of it is on us as Jamaicans, because that is absolutely a huge component of what is required for us to achieve what we're aiming for. In the initial consensus, we really focused on medium to long-term initiatives and programs that needed to be implemented, and there wasn't a laser focus on things that ought to be done immediately. So since then, because we're working on an updated version of the consensus, we've spent some time speaking about a couple of areas that could assist in getting more radical reduction or faster reduction in crime. We recognize that there's been a reduction in violent crimes over the last several months, but how do we get a faster reduction that we're looking for? So I'm going to mention a couple of things very quickly. It is quite clear, the data is suggesting it, that the increased police presence we have seen, the police force has added just about a net 2,000 persons on the street. And it's quite apparent from the data we're seeing that the ability for them to use the intelligence and distribute these additional 2,000 persons have made a difference. So the presence of the force is important. And one of the things we used to have are district constables who are like part-time police officers. So there's a bit of advocacy taking place now for us to reinstitute district constables in some form. The minister has spoken about it in the past, but that will allow us to have more presence on the streets. But the role of the community and the community organizations is one of the huge components. And in this new consensus, the churches have put up their hands and says, look, there's a role that we want to play in bringing more Jamaicans, certainly their constituency, on board in taking a stand against crime. And a lot of that is just how do you interact with the police, the information that is shared are all components. You mentioned states of emergency, and whilst there's not a consensus on that very clearly, there's a consensus and agreement that there's some enhanced security measures that we ought to provide to the authorities to use. The specifics of those needs to be worked out. We are waiting on a policy paper, but there are some enhanced security measures that we believe will be useful for the authorities to utilize. And that was part of the original agreement, and we do envision, the Prime Minister has spoken again about it, we do envision seeing some legislation in that regard.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for speaking with us. God bless all of us, but God bless you and your family, sir. Look after yourself. Thanks again.
And thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, man. I will say it again just before Simone closes off, that there was, and I've said it 100
I know what you're going to say.
What?
There's a time in your life and you remember policemen walking with no...
And I also want to say that one of the founding fathers of the United States says, justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. In other words, don't make it reach your road before you jump up and say, how are you going to Jamaica? You don't need to know the person. You don't need to know where the person come from. If someone is hurt, someone is killed, a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, no, man, we have to ball out loud when things like that happen. Thanks again to Mr. Distant.
All right, Lloyd Distant, Chairman of the Consensus Monitoring Oversight Committee, CMOC. More to come when we return. Soon come.